Hi, everyone, and welcome to another live session with Markham and I. There is some, potentially very exciting not in a good way, breaking news. And Markham, maybe I'll turn it over to you to give us the brief.
Well, maybe instead of, we'll talk about interesting news because this is
Interesting, yes.
the Globe and Mail. Robert Fife, the veteran reporter at the Globe and Mail, broke a story today about how the Alberta and its premier Daniel Smith, and Prime Minister Mark Carney have been negotiating an MOU, a memorandum of understanding, on a new pipeline to the West Coast. And this is interesting because one of the big objections has always been the Oil Tanker Moratorium Act, because that basically bans tankers from around the Prince Rupert area. And so that would, Prince Rupert would be out. I'm not sure about Kitimat, which is close,
Yeah.
whether that applies or not. But be that as it may, clearly the Tanker Moratorium Act was an impediment to any. You know what? I think it is because, of course, the Tanker Moratorium Act killed Gateway North, which was supposed the Gateway pipeline, which was supposed to terminate at Kitimat. Kids, this is a complicated story. So bear with me as I stumble my way through the explanation. So anyway, it looks now like the two parties are close to some kind of an MOU, an agreement on a pipeline. Well, not that long ago, it was yesterday. Smith was in the news saying that the Liberal MPs were the impediment to getting the deal done. Today, as those MPs were going into caucus, I guess Fife was asking them, and nobody was saying no. Nobody. All they were saying is, if there's going to be an agreement, if there's going to be a pipeline built, BC has to be on board. Well, of course, BC is not on board. I mean, we've done some videos here lately talking about Premier David Eby,
Hmm.
and he has been very, very clear. There is, at this moment, no pipeline proponent. That means there is no project, and there's really nothing to talk about, he said. And of course, the Alberta supporters have absolutely lit their hair on fire. They're all over social media, beating up on BC, and they're in the national, the legacy media doing the same thing. The irony here, as I pointed out in a video yesterday, is that essentially Eby is doing to Smith what Smith has been doing to Carney and Trudeau before Carney, for the last three and a half years. This going in the media and complaining, a grievance culture. You can't do
Hmm.
this. We don't
Hmm.
want it. You're jeopardizing existing projects, potential projects. You're jeopardizing First Nation buy-in, on and on and on. So this is, if Mark Carney and Danielle Smith ever thought that this was going to be a walk in the park, that BC would just roll over, they they've been disabused of that notion. And the irony is that, because I covered the Trans Mountain Expansion project back in 2016, 2017, 2018, 2019. And it was, I covered a couple of big rallies, in Burnaby, where thousands and thousands of people would, poured into the streets to protest. And there were even bigger protests in downtown Vancouver. The BC is not giving its approval, and there's a lot of opposition within the province there was a opposition to Trans Mountain expansion, and not anything has changed in the intervening years. So this looks like, I don't know how this is going to play out, MC, but it's going to be nasty, brutish, and it won't be short. It looks like we're in for a long fight.
So do you think this is a genuine breakthrough, a change, or do you think that this is more trying to pressure BC? Do you think that that's playing a part here, or do you think there's going to be a real MOU signed and the federal government's going to force BC into line?
Well, see, this is the essential conundrum here, because
Yeah,
on the one hand, as we've said many times, Trans Mountain expansion for sure established that the federal government has exclusive jurisdiction over pipelines that cross provincial borders.
right.
So the BC government can't stop it. The municipalities can't stop it. The city of Burnaby took them to court, and First Nations can't stop it. They do not have a veto. That's been nobody said anything different since then. So if Mark Carney decides that Danielle Smith is going to get a pipeline to the West Coast, he can make BC swallow it. He can do that.
Right.
But here's the thing, on the one hand, he can, and on the other hand, he keeps saying, and I read the comments from uh, uh, Stephen Guilbeault, the former environment minister, and Jonathan Wilkinson, who was the successor or his predecessor as environment minister, but then became energy minister under Trudeau. And they have said no pipeline without BC agreement.
Right. Right.
Well, we've got an essential contradiction. How do you say, on the one hand, yeah, we're going to, we got an MOU with Alberta, we're going to build a pipeline. And then on the other hand, say, but only if BC agrees and is on board. And BC has said very loudly, we're not on board. How do you square that circle? I don't understand. I mean, unless there's something going on behind closed doors, like EB being in on a deal. And look, I mean, I've always said, and you remember, go back to March when we first started talking about this, and I said Alberta's going to get a pipeline.
Yeah.
All the signals were there, and here we are. We're in the final, part of the race. And I also said that EB will have a price, and Carney will have to decide if he's going to pay the price. What does he give EB to get him on board? So I could see this is not beyond the realm of possibility, where on the behind closed doors, EB is in on the discussions and has named some ridiculous price, and Carney has agreed to it. But everybody knows that out in public, EB has to be opposed. And we've seen this all the time. I mean, we would see, Jason Kenney when he was Premier of Alberta fighting with Justin Trudeau when he was
Yeah.
Prime Minister of Canada, and they would go at it. Kenney would go after Trudeau hammers and tongs. Meanwhile, their ministers and their bureaucrats are meeting behind closed doors and having very friendly conversations. And probably Kenney and Trudeau were having them as well. This is common stuff. It happens all the time in politics. But boy, this is a big one. And I just don't like. I think that if David Eby did in fact do that and cut a deal with Carney and Smith, I think he'd be bounced out of the premier's chair.
Well,
I
what
think
would
that
he possibly want? Like, what is the thing that I mean, that's the big question. If he did make a deal and, BC is going to get something out of this, what is it that would be so big that it would, make it okay
whatever
or
it is, a lot of federal money would be attached to it.
right. Yeah, of
Like not a
course.
billion or two. It would have to be like tens and tens and tens of billions of dollars. I can't think of anything offhand. Anything that he wants, like new mines or, port expansions or those sorts of things are
Yeah,
on the table anyway.
right. Yeah.
I mean, that's part of the One Canadian Economy Act is you build out infrastructure to support the pivot away from the United States. And so we can sell more of our exports to Europe and Asia. So it's not like you can say, well, I'll buy you a port because, Carney was going to do it anyway.
Yeah.
And he's already committed. He's already committed to the one at Montreal, Port of Montreal. He's already
Hmm.
made very encouraging noises about the port at Churchill, Manitoba. And then there's the question of BC. I mean, you can't talk about Asian exports and increasing those without, upgrading ports in British Columbia. So I don't see where Carney has a lot of leverage aside from the big red checkbook. He can write a check for a lot of money and buy EB off that way, and hopefully, hope that EB can sell it to the, British Columbia voters. But boy, that's a long shot. So we're going to have to wait and see how this plays out, MC, because at this point in the game, there's a lot of unanswered questions.
Well, and I mean, we've pointed out here many times, not only are these unanswered questions, but what's the math on building this new pipeline? There's lots of questions, that we've brought up that, I mean, obviously there might be this deal, but there's no legitimate answers to any of that. And obviously taxpayers are going to be on the hook for this project.
Well, I'm not, we'll see how that plays out because there isn't a private sector proponent. And Smith has said there'll be that the government of Alberta will be the proponent. So what
Right.
does that mean? What does that mean? Does the government of Alberta create a crown corporation that builds a pipeline from Edmonton to Prince Rupert? I mean, that would be the reasonable construction to put on that. But there's a big issue here for Canadians. Folks, there is no business case for that pipeline. And we have proven that, I think, pretty conclusively here at Energy Media. What we've
Yep.
said, we've done a number of things. So let me walk you through this. Why would Mark Carney, who's a PhD economist from Oxford and knows this stuff inside and out, why would he be agreeing to a pipeline, you know, in the face of evidence to the contrary? And and the argument is that, and I've heard this from Ottawa contacts, that Carney thinks that a pipeline, even though he doesn't agree with it, is the price of keeping the country together. Now, that's argument's got all kinds of problems because if you get Alberta and BC fighting, is that keeping the country together? But arguably not. But here's the thing: there are not going to be any customers after 2030 for Alberta oil because we have tracked down Chinese modeling, energy demand modeling, and the Sinopec, the big national state-owned refiner, has done modeling where they say that oil in China's oil demand by 2050 will fall from 17.4 million barrels a day, where it is now today, down to 7 million barrels a day. Sorry, 7.5 million barrels a day. The Chinese National Petroleum Corporation, again, state-owned, says it'll fall to 6.5 million barrels a day. There's a economic think tank attached to the Peking University. It says 5.5 million barrels a day. So anywhere between 10 and 12 million barrels a day of demand is going to be lost in China over the next 25 years, probably the next 20 years after 2030. And already China's oil demand has flattened. And you got to remember, China was the biggest driver of growing oil demand in the world over the last 20 years. So in a very short period of time, China has thrown the brakes on by electrifying its transportation sector, cars and trucks and buses and what have you, all of which would normally run on gasoline and diesel. Now they don't, they run on electricity. That's the issue here. So they're essentially building a pipeline to nowhere. And even if there is, they say, oh no, well, there's going to be 7 million barrels a day of demand and we'll compete for that. Who are the competitors? Saudi Arabia and Iraq.
Right. Yeah.
Two of the lowest cost Middle Eastern producers you could possibly get. And whereas on the Trans Mountain expansion, uh, shipping costs cost you $18 a barrel to get to China. It costs the Saudis and the Iraqis too. That's a huge competitive disadvantage for Canadian producers. And they still can't produce sour heavy crude for as little as the Saudis and Iraqis. So and then there's all sorts of other issues, like many of the Asian countries have explicit policies to wean themselves off oil because they don't like
Right.
paying for it with, like last year, China imported $325 billion of oil and 40 to $50 billion of LNG. That's a really big incentive to electrify and reduce your LNG and your oil imports. And that's not the beginning. There's all sorts of things happening. It's a very complex situation. So we've shown at Energy Media, we've done the work, we've talked to the experts, we've found the reports that the business case as it stands at this moment is very, very weak. And I would say there is no business case for it whatsoever. So
Right. Well, I mean,
so go ahead.
Lisa's just chiming in here on the comments. She said, you don't want to compete with Saudi Arabia because they're playing on both sides. You will lose again like we did in 2015. So, you know, it- those partners or those competitors, that you're talking about, they're not going to be easy to compete with. Uh, for Canada.
No, that's exactly right. And it's not just them. Venezuela, Mexico.
Right.
You know,
Yeah.
there are other like their transportation costs from Latin America are about $5 or $6 a barrel.
Yeah.
That's still a lot less than $18 a barrel, right? So there are all, and then you've got to remember that as global oil demand falls, because here, let's be very clear, we are not the evidence as we see it. And by the way, if you're not a Substack subscriber to Thoughtful Energy Journalism, our Substack, you really need to because we wrote an essay last week in which we compared the assumptions behind OPEC, IEA steps, ExxonMobil, and so on, compared them to the real world evidence, and they didn't pass the test.
Yeah.
The evidence is that the world is electrifying far faster than those bullish energy modelers are predicting. The scenario that did jibe with most closely to the data is the IEA APS scenario. And the APS scenario calls for oil consumption to fall from 103 million barrels a day today to 55 million barrels a day by 2050. That would be a disaster for Alberta, and it would essentially render that pipeline uneconomic. I don't know how that pipeline would be able to compete, in a world where you've basically got 100 million barrels a day of supply chasing 55 million barrels a day of consumption. I mean, prices would be low enough and they'd never compete. So all of that evidence together. Oh, and I need to tie a little bow around this, MC. You ask, why is Carney pursuing this pipeline if he knows
Yeah.
better? And we have an answer for you because I emailed his Minister of Energy, Tim Hodgson, the NRCan department, and I said, which scenarios are you informing your minister? And they said, steps, OPEC, um, ExxonMobil, BP, and Shell. All of the bullish forecasters is who they talk to. They don't take into account things like the IEA APS. And then I did the same thing with British Columbia with Adrian Dix, their energy minister. It's
Yep.
not oil there. In that case, it's LNG, and exactly the same forecast. So the industry, Alberta, Premier Danielle Smith, Mark Carney, Tim Hodgson, Adrian Dix, and David Eby in BC are all singing from the same song sheet because they're reading they're basing their views on energy demand modeling that does not line up with the current trends within the global energy system. And so they're making decisions based on bad data, which is the absolute worst kind of policy decisions you can make.
Yep. Not
So
evidence informed
well,
decision making. Well, it is. I mean, I just want to say hi to David, who's just joined us on YouTube, and he just said former Chinese ownership in the oil sands gave them all the experience they need to develop their own deposits, so they're not going to want anything from us, which is an
you know
interesting
what?
comment.
That's a very good point. Now, I don't know, to the best of my knowledge, they don't have heavy oil in China. But you know what? They do have domestic production, and it's a lot more than we think. And I was reading a Bloomberg article about that just the other day, is China is ramping up its domestic oil production because it wants to get away from imports. So
Right.
Dave is certainly correct in that, the Chinese are increasing its domestic oil production. The question for me is, will it be the heavy sour crude that Alberta will be shipping over there or hopes to ship over there, and will it compete with that? We don't know. I don't know offhand.
And I've also just dropped a link to Markham's most recent Substack, so it's there in the comments. Check it out, and also remember to subscribe to it. We've got lots of new content coming out on there almost every day.
Yeah, I mean these are not just I don't know, the kinds of political decisions that get made and then we can move on and whatever. This is earth shaking if that pipeline gets approved. And here's another thing. We're all Canadian. I'm a Canadian taxpayer. You're a Canadian taxpayer. the taxpayer's already on the hook. And let me explain why. The only source of oil that can grow is going to be the Alberta oil sands. The conventional production in Alberta is forecast at 500,000 barrels a day, roughly, all the way out to 2050. It is just not going to change. They don't have the. There is some question of the shale oil up in the Montney and the Duvernay up in the northwest Alberta, northeast BC, but it's not very much. It's not very well developed. They don't have infrastructure, so building it out is not going to be that easy. So it's going to be the oil sands. And the oil sands already, their phase one of their decarbonization plan, their carbon capture and storage plan, the federal government has already committed $8 billion of tax credits. And the Alberta government has already committed $2 billion. So taxpayers are already on the hook for $10 billion. And MC, I'm going to put you on the spot here. What percentage of oil sands emissions will all those billions of dollars, how much will it reduce it by?
Well,
Take
I
a
don't
guess.
think any. I'm going to say zero.
No, it'll reduce it some, but
Oh,
for the total budget is $16 billion, and it's going to reduce it by 12%.
oh, that's not very
12%.
much. That doesn't sound like a good deal.
Well, the former Cenovus Energy, Cenovus is one of the biggest oil sands
Yep.
producers, and Alex Pourbet. And he said a couple of years ago in the media, and actually I had their Pathways vice president on shortly after, Cameron, and I asked him this question. And I said, Pourbet said it would cost $50 billion, $75 billion to decarbonize the oil sands. 50 billion of that would be for carbon capture and storage. And they expect government to put in $50 billion,
Wow.
two-thirds of the cost they expect. And I asked Cameron at that time, and he said, yes, that's our number. We're sticking by it. We said it publicly, so we'll stand by it. What he didn't say is that the oil sands production is forecast to go up by 500,000 barrels a day by 2030, and if there's a million barrel a day pipeline, it'll go up another 500,000 a day by 2035. So the cost that Cameron gave me was kind of the status quo cost. If you increase production, then you've got to spend more money on CCS, and there's more taxpayers' money. So this is a case where I would be surprised if the taxpayer didn't subsidize that pipeline to a large extent. I mean, we paid $34 billion out of taxpayer dollars to build the Trans Mountain expansion. And then on top, we're going to pay for CCS. And God knows what else we're going to wind up paying for. And it's going to be an even bigger bill than we thought. This could be a white elephant, a boondoggle of epic proportions by the time if, our political leaders stampede us into this really, in my opinion, bad deal, very bad deal.
I just want to give a shout out to Neolithic Transit Revolution. He's joining us, and he also just wanted to say it's a very good Substack article that you put out yesterday, Markham. So definitely, he's recommending it to everyone. So thanks for that. Um, so I,
Well,
I
thanks,
guess my
Ian.
question, yeah, he's one of our number one fans, so we really appreciate the support for the Substack. So my question is, so the MOU gets signed, and then what happens next? What's the next step?
Well, I don't even understand actually why they need an MOU, to be honest, and
Yeah,
I'll tell you why. I guess maybe it's because of the Tanker Moratorium Act. There has to be that has to be an agreement to carve out a space for a new pipeline, and I'm not sure what that'll mean. Those are Fife's words, but I imagine that's why they need it. But Smith has said very clearly, we couldn't get a private sector proponent. We now have a consortium of the Alberta government and three private sector advisors.
right.
And if I remember correctly, it was Southbow
Yep.
and
Trans
and and
Mountain
and
and
Enbridge would be the third one, I
Enbridge.
think.
Yep, you're
Yeah.
right.
Okay. So then the question becomes, I think, how do you skin this cat? So you could do it as a consortium, And you could have the Alberta government leading, or you could have one of the private sector companies leading, and the Alberta government de-risks it with low-cost loans or loan guarantees, or maybe it takes equity, like it did in Keystone XL, which then, of course, it lost all $1.5 billion. So there's a number of ways to structure this. And what Smith said was that by March, the consortium would have a proposal into the major projects office and so for consideration. So even if the MOU is signed by the parties, then
Yep.
Alberta still has to put together a proposal for the pipeline, and it still has to be considered, and the cabinet has to decide whether it will be designated as a project of national interest. But if you've already signed an MOU with Alberta, I think it's a foregone conclusion that it will become a pony just because you're already politically committed. I don't see how else you do it.
Yeah, I mean, Ian's uh, basically saying the same thing here in the comments. He's saying, I think the MOU has more to do with the steps Alberta is required to take to buy support. So, you know, this is might just be a bit of a political move to show that there is support on both sides as this project goes in to the major
Well,
project
there's
office.
definitely going to be a lot of political tap dancing to make this work,
Yeah,
and it's not clear to me, like I said earlier, it appears to me that Carney has painted himself into a corner because essentially Smith is getting everything that she wants,
yeah,
right? I mean, it's astonishing to me that Alberta, even though it elects almost no Liberal MPs, even though it's a thorn in the side of the federal government, it makes life miserable for whoever happens to be prime minister, and yet it keeps getting both Trudeau and Carney now seem to be bending over backwards to give Alberta what it's wants. Now, we know why that is. We know why that is because Canada needs investment. Our capital investment has been falling, our productivity levels have been falling, and the oil patch is a big spender of capital and a big contributor to rising productivity.
right,
Okay. So, and government revenues. And if you're in Alberta and you're getting $24 billion a year of royalties, and then you're in Ottawa and you're getting between $3 and $6 billion a year on taxes that are connected to the oil and gas industry, and you're Mark Carney and you're saying, well, I got to build. I need capital. You don't want $3 to $6 billion, being lost. You want more of that money. So I think that's the motivation here.
yeah.
But here's the irony. Hodgson was in the media here about a month ago, just bashing the Trudeau government for its oil and gas policies, and essentially exporting more oil and gas to pay for your other clean energy stuff like a national power grid is exactly what Trudeau said 10 years ago.
Yeah.
It's the words are almost identical. So, he's talking out of both sides of his mouth.
Well,
Anyway,
I mean, using the money to fund into the transition, I mean, was something that Trudeau said all the time. He was trying to, capitalize what we
yeah.
can now to pay for our future. And I mean that does in some ways make sense, but Trudeau, I guess, framed it very differently than how Carney's presenting himself or Carney's government and ministers.
Well, it's going to be very interesting. So, folks, the news today, if it turns out that Alberta and Canada sign an MOU, we're going to have a political eruption because EB has already he sent many warning shots across the bow of Alberta and Mark Carney. And once that MOU is in place, then people are going to go, aha, this is serious. And all the promises about how BC has to sign on and be in agreement, and how the First Nations have to sign on and be in agreement, will be revealed for the pathetic window dressing that they really were. And then the fight is on, and it's going to be a doozy. We'll see how this all plays out, but grab the popcorn, kids, because it's going to be a loud one.
Well, and I have to promise people we will keep our eye on this story and we will be bringing you more info as it comes up. Of
We will.
course, We will. And of course, if you like our content, please make sure you're subscribed to the channel. Check out our Substack. The link is there in the comments for you. And yeah, I mean, also share our content if you find that this is, good
Please
speaking
do.
points for you and your friends. We really appreciate the support.
I want to add a point to that. So we're asking you share it, subscribe it, consume it, all of our
Yes.
content. We don't talk about this a lot, and I'm not going to give you the exact number, but I will say that in the last year since we switched to, we were video only journalism, we're slowly adding back in some print and audio now that we've kind of got our journalism model much more solidified than it was before. But video is still a big chunk of what we do. But since we made that move, we have become one of Canada's biggest online independent media. And that covers a lot of ground. And what that means is Energy Media has a big megaphone. And so when you're supporting us, when you're consuming our stuff, when you're sharing it, you're contributing to something. We're now I hate to say a player because yeah, we're really not. But we are I think an important contributor to these public conversations. That I think can be said. And our voice now is getting listened to in places like Ottawa and Toronto that it wasn't prior. So your support actually is probably having a more effect than you maybe have thought it was.
Yeah. Well, thanks everyone for joining us. And this video is going to be live for a while. Please add more comments. We can keep the conversation going even after we end the live. So thanks everyone, and see you next time.